On a Wednesday afternoon in late October of 2001, Normand Bélanger stood at the edge of his equipment yard in Lac-Saint-Jean, Quebec, and watched a courier van back out of his gravel lane with a registered letter he had just signed for. He stood there, holding the envelope for a moment before he opened it. The sky was low and gray the way it gets in the Lac-Saint-Jean basin before the first real snow, and the yard around him held 11 pieces of broken farm equipment in various states of disassembly, and he was thinking about the hydraulic pump housing sitting on his workbench inside that he needed to finish before Friday. He was not thinking about what the letter would mean. That came later. Let me tell you about Normand Bélanger, because you need to understand the man before you can understand the decision he made in the weeks that followed. Normand was 52 years old in 2001, and he had been repairing agricultural and forestry equipment in Lac-Saint-Jean for 24 years, not selling it, not renting it, repairing it. As the sole operator of Bélanger Mécanique Agricole, a 800-square-foot shop on Route 169 between Roberval and Saint-Félicien that he had built in stages starting in 1977 on a parcel of land his uncle had farmed and eventually stopped farming because his knees gave out before the market did. The shop had a steel roof and a poured concrete floor with a drain channel he had cut himself in 1983. It had a hydraulic press he had bought from a closing implement dealer in Alma in 1991, and a surface grinder he had rebuilt from a machine that had spent 3 years rusting behind a closed machine shop in Chicoutimi before Normand drove up one November and offered the building's new owner $400 for it. The sign above the bay doors was made from a piece of barn board his uncle had given him. It was still there in 2001. Normand did not replace things that were still doing their job. He had started the shop in 1977 with a welder, a hydraulic jack, 2 floor jacks, and a reputation that his father had built over 30 years of fixing every piece of farm machinery in the county without ever charging a man more than the work cost him to do. His father, Rémy Bélanger, had run a small repair operation out of his barn in St. Prime until his eyes got too bad for close work in 1982. Rémy had taught Normand that a machine is only as broken as the man looking at it believes it to be, and that belief is a choice. He had also taught him that the farmers in this part of Quebec had been making do and making things work since the land was first cleared, and that a mechanic who understood that history could always find a way. Normand had carried that lesson for 24 years. His machines didn't come back with the same problem twice. The people who brought him equipment were dairy operators, blueberry growers, potato farmers, logging contractors, and municipal road crews from 3 counties who had learned, most of them, through some version of the same experience, that Normand Bélanger could fix what the dealers said wasn't worth fixing. They left equipment at the edge of his yard the way you leave a problem with someone you trust, with the reasonable confidence that the problem would be solved. Combines with cracked gear housings, skidder hydraulics that had failed so completely that the dealer's service manager had recommended scrapping the machine outright, potato harvester drive assemblies that had sheared under the wet clay conditions in the fields north of Dolbeau-Mistassini. Normand fixed them. He always had the parts. Agri-Pièces Laurentides was the reason he always had the parts. They were a regional parts distributor out of Quebec City that had been supplying independent repair shops and farm implement dealers across central and eastern Quebec since the early 1960s. They carried components for agricultural and forestry equipment going back decades: hydraulic seals, planetary gears, PTO shafts, cylinder rebore sleeves, kingpins, differential housings. The kind of inventory the national chains had stopped maintaining because the equipment was old and the demand was geographically thin. Agri-Pièces had maintained it because their founder, a man named Gérard Louis Sauvaget, had understood that the farmers of Quebec did not replace their machinery on a schedule that suited a distributor's inventory model. They replaced it when it was finished, and until it was finished, they needed someone who could fix it. Gérard Louis Sauvaget had died in 1995. His daughter had run the business for 3 years before selling it in 1998 to a consolidation group based in Toronto that operated distribution businesses across several provinces. The new owners spent 2 years analyzing the inventory against margin targets and procurement efficiency benchmarks. In September of 2001, they sent registered letters to every account holder in their Quebec and Ontario networks, informing them that 280 part numbers were being discontinued, effective 60 days from the date of the letter, as part of a strategic rationalization of the product portfolio. That was the letter Normand held in his gravel lane on that gray Wednesday afternoon. He read it at the workbench after he had washed his hands. He read it twice. He set it down beside the hydraulic pump housing he had been machining for a potato farmer in Saint Bruno de Guy, and he stood there without moving for a long time. Of the 280 discontinued part numbers, 79 of them were components he ordered regularly. Regularly meaning quarterly at minimum, meaning that without them, there were entire categories of equipment in this part of Quebec that would become unrepairable. Older Massey Ferguson combine drives, a generation of timberjack skidder hydraulics that the logging operations between Chibougamau and Latuque still depended on. John Deere row crop equipment from the 1970s that the smaller dairy farms in the basin had been running continuously for 30 years because it was paid for and it worked and there was no money to replace it. The equipment was not going away. The people who owned it had nowhere else to turn. The parts were about to disappear. Most men in Normand's position would have started calling their customers, would have begun the uncomfortable process of explaining that certain repairs would no longer be possible, that some equipment might have to be retired. Normand did not do that. What Normand did was go to the filing cabinet in the corner of the shop and pull out every invoice he had received from Agri-Pièces Laurentides in the past 10 years. He spread them across the workbench. He spent one evening going through them methodically, writing part numbers and annual usage quantities on a legal pad in his careful, narrow handwriting. By 10 o'clock he had a list. By 10:30 he had a calculation. Of the 79 part numbers he needed, there was somewhere between 2 and 5 years of remaining stock at Agri-Pièces, depending on the item, if nobody else was buying it out. He called Agri-Pièces the next morning and asked to speak to whoever was managing the discontinuation liquidation. The person managing it was a woman named Patricia Kowalski, who worked in procurement for the Toronto parent company and who had been sent to the Quebec City warehouse specifically to oversee the liquidation process. She was organized and clear, and she had the numbers in front of her before Normand had finished explaining who he was. She told him that the remaining stock on the discontinued lines was available at a 45% reduction to existing account holders until the end of the 60-day window, after which it would be sold in bulk to secondary distributors or written off. Normand asked for the total value of the stock across his 79 part numbers at the discounted price. Patricia Kowalski put him on hold for several. When she came back, she told him the figure. It was $94,000. Normand said he would call her back by the end of the week. He did not have $94,000. He had $31. $0 in the business account and a line of credit at Caisse Desjardins that he had opened in 1993 and had never used beyond a single short-term draw that he had paid back in 4 months. His shop property was paid for. His house 2 kilometers up the road was paid for. He sat in the cab of his truck in the shop yard that evening after the work was done and he did the arithmetic on the back of the invoice sheet he'd been using as a notepad, and then he sat there for a while longer, not doing arithmetic, just thinking. His wife, Lisette, brought a thermos of coffee out to the truck at 8 o'clock. She knocked on the passenger window, and he unlocked the door, and she got in and poured 2 cups and said nothing for a moment, which was the way she handled situations she understood were not ready for words yet. Eventually, he explained the situation. She listened. She asked 2 questions. She looked out through the windshield at the shop for a while. Then she said that if he was certain the parts would be needed, she didn't see what the alternative was. He said he was certain. She said then they should do it. They finished the coffee and went inside. Let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever watched someone commit fully to a thing that looked unreasonable from the outside, but was in fact the most considered decision they had ever made? That is what Normand Bélanger did in the 10 days after that phone call. He was not acting on instinct. He was acting on 24 years of records in a filing cabinet, on the knowledge of exactly which farmers in 3 counties ran exactly which equipment and exactly how often it needed what kind of attention. He knew the demand the way a farmer knows his own fields. The wet corners, the reliable acres, the places where the soil does what you expect. He knew the parts would be needed. He knew no one else would have them. He bought time. Specifically, he bought somewhere between 3 and 6 years of time, depending on how the work came in, and he had a plan for what to do with that time. He arranged a loan through the Caisse des Jardins, speaking with a loans officer named Maurice Trottier, who had grown up 2 concessions over from Norman's father, and who understood, without needing it explained, at length that Normand Bélanger's judgment on agricultural equipment in this part of Quebec was not a thing to bet against. The loan was approved within a week, secured against the shop property. Normand drove to Quebec City on a Tuesday. He met Patricia Kowalski at the warehouse on Boulevard Hamel, and they walked the floor together for 2 hours while he verified quantities against his list, and then he signed the purchase order for $94,000 worth of discontinued agricultural and forestry equipment components. He rented a cube van. He drove it back to Roberval. His son, Theo, who was 19 at the time, and who had been working Saturdays in the shop since he was 13, helped him unload for 2 days. They stacked the inventory in the back of the shop along the north wall, in a system that Normand organized by equipment family and then by part function. Lisette came to the shop on the second evening and stood in the doorway looking at the rows of cardboard boxes and steel parts bins and gasket sets and said, quietly, that it was more than she had imagined. Normand said it was what was needed. She looked at it for another moment and then said that he had better make sure none of it went to waste. He said he wouldn't let it. Now let me tell you what Normand did with those 3 to 6 years he had bought himself, because this is where the story stops being about a man with an inventory problem and starts being about something larger. The parts he had purchased were finished components: seals, gears, shafts, sleeves, ready to install. But Normand had been working with this equipment long enough to understand not just how the parts functioned, but what they were made of, what tolerances they were machined to, and what it would take to produce them from raw stock if the purchased inventory eventually ran out. He had a hydraulic press. He had a metal lathe he had bought in pieces from a trade school in Jonquière in 1988 and assembled himself over 3 months. He had a drill press, a bandsaw, a surface grinder. He did not have everything he would need, but he had the foundation, and he understood what the gaps were. He spent the first year after the Quebec City trip locating raw material sources. He drove to machine shops and steel service centers in Saguenay and Trois-Rivières and Quebec City. He contacted a seal manufacturer in Drummondville that did custom short runs for industrial clients. He found a gear-cutting operation in Shawinigan that could produce spur gears and bevel gears to his specifications if he brought them the tooth geometry and material callouts. He located a hydraulic cylinder specialist in Lévis who could produce custom-bore sleeves from seamless tube in small quantities. He built, piece by piece, an alternative supply chain that did not depend on any single distributor and that reached back to raw materials. It took him 2 years to build it to the point where he could rely on it. During those 2 years, he was also running the shop, repairing machines, managing customers, keeping the work moving. He worked 6 days a week. He worked most Sunday mornings. Lisette brought lunch to the shop on Saturdays, and they ate together at the workbench with parts spread out around them, and Normand explained what he was working on. She listened and asked questions that were, without fail, more practical than the ones he had been asking himself, and several times she identified something he had not thought of. That was their Saturday, and they were not unhappy with it. By the end of 2004, Normand Bélanger could source or manufacture, from raw stock or through his network of specialty suppliers, 54 of the 79 part numbers he had originally purchased from Agri-Pièces. The remaining 25 were either too complex to produce economically at his scale or required tooling he did not have. For those, he had located alternative suppliers, smaller specialty houses serving the vintage agricultural market in New Brunswick, or had found ways to adapt available components to function equivalently. He drew down the Agri-Pièces inventory slowly and deliberately, using his sourced and fabricated parts wherever he could and the purchased stock where he had to. He tracked every part, every usage, every remaining quantity. The ledger for this was a separate notebook from his regular shop records, kept in the top drawer of his desk, updated every Friday afternoon without exception. Let me tell you about the winter of 2005 because that is when the phone calls started coming from the other shops. There were, in the agricultural and forestry belt, running from Lac-Saint-Jean through the Mauricie to the upper Outaouais, perhaps 15 or 20 independent repair operations that had been dealing with the same problem Normand had faced in 2001. Some of them had received the same letter from Agri-Pièces. Most of them had bought what their cash position allowed, which was not much, and had spent the intervening years managing the slow erosion of their ability to service older equipment. By 2005, several of them had stopped taking certain repair categories entirely. They were turning away work that they had been doing for 20 years. Farmers who had always brought their equipment to the same shop were being told the parts no longer existed. In the farm supply stores and the cooperative offices and the back tables of the diners along the highway, word had been moving about Normand Bélanger. The word was specific. He still had the parts. He could still fix the old equipment. Nobody knew quite how, but the word was reliable. Because the people saying it were farmers and mechanics, and in this part of Quebec, those people do not recommend a shop unless they have seen the work themselves. The first call from another shop came from a man named Alphonse Grenier in Dolbeau-Mistassini, who had been doing repair work for the logging operations north of town for 18 years and who needed a PTO shaft coupling for a Timberjack 230 skidder that he had promised back to a contractor before freeze-up. He had called every distributor he knew. He had called dealers in Quebec City and Chicoutimi. He called Normand as a last measure because a dairy farmer he respected had told him it was worth trying. Normand told him to come by Thursday. Alphonse Grenier drove down Thursday morning. Normand handed him the coupling, which he had machined to specification from a piece of alloy steel bar stock the previous afternoon, heat-treated in an arrangement he had worked out with a small metal treating operation in Alma that did work for the mining industry. Alphonse held the part in both hands, turned it, looked at the spline, checked the fit against the worn original he had brought for reference. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he asked how much. Norman told him. Alphonse said that was less than Agri Pièces had charged. Norman said he was aware of that. After Alphonse Grenier, there were others. Not many at first, 2 or 3 shops in the first season, each one calling about a specific part for a specific job with a deadline behind it. But the calls continued, and Norman kept answering them, and by 2007 he had a parallel business running alongside the repair operation, producing and supplying obsolete agricultural components to independent shops across a 5-county area. He had not advertised. He had not built a website or sent a flyer. There was a second ledger now, beside the first, tracking orders from shops the way the first tracked orders from farms, and Lisette had started keeping both of them because her handwriting was cleaner and her memory for which shop had ordered what and when was, in Norman's honest assessment, better than his. The outcome that the Toronto parent company had modeled when they discontinued those 280-part numbers was that the market for obsolete agricultural components in rural Quebec was too thin to be worth serving. What they had modeled incorrectly was what would happen to that demand when the supply was removed. It did not disappear. It concentrated. It found the one place where someone had decided it was worth serving, and it went there, and it stayed there, and it grew. By 2009, the parts supply side of Norman's operation was generating more revenue than the repair work. He had not planned this. He had planned to keep his own shop running. The additional business had grown because the need was real and nobody else was meeting it. Let me tell you about the fall of 2010, because that is when the equipment arrived. Norman had been watching his lathe struggle for 2 years. Certain components, hydraulic cylinder rods, PTO yoke shafts, some of the more demanding gear arbors required tolerances that his 1970s-era machine could hold only on good days with careful setup, and there were days when it couldn't hold them at all, and those parts went in the scrap bin, which Norman tolerated less graciously each time. He needed a better machine. He found one through a contact in the machining trade in Saguenay, a 1984 Colchester Mastiff engine lathe, 13 inches over the bed, that had come out of a closing precision parts shop in Jonquière and was sitting in a storage unit because the shop's owner had not gotten around to selling it. The owner wanted $6,500. Norman drove to Jonquière, inspected the machine for an afternoon, found that it needed a new chuck, a tailstock quill, and some attention to the gib adjustments, but was otherwise in better condition than machines half its age. He bought it. He spent 3 weeks setting it up in the shop, aligning the bed, truing the headstock, replacing the worn components. When it was running, he moved it to the center of the floor where the old lathe had been, and the old lathe went against the east wall where it has served as a backup ever since. With the Colchester, he could hold tolerances on shaft work that his previous machine couldn't approach on its best day. That opened up hydraulic cylinder rod repair work he had been sending out to a specialist in Quebec City. He brought it in-house. The Quebec City specialist called a month later to ask if something had changed. Normand told him he had gotten a better lathe. The specialist asked what kind, and then the man said those were well-made machines. Normand said he knew. Theo had finished a technical program at the CEGEP in Alma by this point and had been working full-time in the shop since 2007. He had come back with hydraulics training that went beyond what Normand had taught him, and with a precision measuring discipline, the use of CMM concepts, of systematic tolerance verification, that Normand had developed by instinct and experience but had never formalized. Theo formalized it. He built a measurement protocol for every part type the shop produced regularly. the gauge sizes to use, the checkpoints, the accept-reject criteria. He laminated the cards and hung them above each workstation. Norman watched this process with the expression he used when watching a first cut on an unfamiliar material, attentive, uncommitted, withholding judgment, until he had seen the result. The result was that their rejection rate on produced parts dropped by a third in the first year. Norman said the cards were a good idea. Theo did not make a point of this. Lisette retired from her position at the school board in Saint-Félicien in 2011 and came to the shop full-time. She converted both ledgers into a database over the course of several months, working on a laptop at a small desk she had set up in the corner of the office, entering records by hand from every page going back to 2001. Norman watched this process with the same expression he had used watching Theo hang the measurement cards. He had always known what was in those ledgers, but he had never been able to see across them, had never been able to ask the ledgers a question and get an answer. The database could do that. It told him that demand for skidder hydraulic components had increased 40% since 2007. It told him that 3 specific part numbers accounted for nearly a quarter of all his intershop sales. It told him that one customer, a logging contractor in Latuque, had ordered 23 times in 4 years and had never returned a part. He used this to adjust what he kept in stock and what he made to order. By 2014, Bélanger Mécanique Agricole had 3 people working in it besides Normand, Theo, and Lisette. There was a machinist named Fernand who had come to the shop from a closing machine shop in Roberval and who had, over 4 years, developed a particular skill on the Colchester that Norman considered very close to his own. There was a young woman named Carol Bisson who handled parts assembly, shipping, and incoming inspection, with a system efficiency that had reduced their order turnaround time by nearly 2 days. And there was a retired millwright named Octave Beaupré, who came in 3 days a week specifically to do hydraulic cylinder rebore work and seal replacement, because he had spent 30 years doing nothing else, and he was faster and more precise at it than anyone else Norman had ever seen. He was not interested in retiring again. He said the shop was quiet enough, and the work was honest. Norman told him he was welcome as long as he wanted to be there. Octave is still there. Let me tell you about the call that came in March of 2017, because that is when the scale of what the shop had became difficult to ignore. The call came from a man named Sébastien Aubin, who managed fleet maintenance for a regional forestry cooperative operating across the Upper Mauricie and Lower Abitibi. The cooperative ran a fleet of older harvesting machines and forwarders that had been purchased used in the early 2000s and maintained continuously since. The average age of the fleet was 22 years. The parts supply for most of these machines had been effectively exhausted through normal distribution channels by 2014. The cooperative had been managing by cannibalizing machines that were less critical or had lower hours, but they were reaching the limits of what that approach could sustain. Sébastien Aubin had found Norman's name through a maintenance manager at a blueberry operation in Alma who had been a customer since 2003. He called on a Tuesday. He laid out the situation clearly and asked whether Norman asked him to send the equipment list and the parts requirements. What arrived 2 days later was a detailed document, 31 specific component types across 6 machine families, with quantity needs and the operational criticality of each. Norman spread it on the workbench and spent an evening going through it with Theo. Of the 31 component types, they could currently supply or manufacture 24 of them. The remaining 7 required either casting work, specialized heat treatment beyond what their Alma contact could handle, or materials they had not previously sourced. Over the following 3 months, Norman solved 5 of the 7. He found a pattern maker in Quebec City who could produce sand casting patterns from his drawings. He located a heat treating facility in Sherbrooke through a contact in the mining supply industry that could handle the case hardening specifications he needed. He adapted two of the remaining components from available stock mass through a modification process he and Theo worked out over 2 weekends on the shop floor. The two he couldn't solve, he told Sébastien Aubin he couldn't solve, and explained exactly why, and suggested 2 alternative suppliers for those specific items that he knew from other work. Sébastien Aubin said no supplier had ever explained their limitations that clearly before. Normand said it seemed like the reasonable thing to do. The forestry cooperative became a regular account. Over the next 4 years, Normand's shop supplied components that kept 29 harvesting machines and forwarders running across the Mauricie. The cooperative's equipment managers visited twice, and both times they walked the floor with the expression Normand had learned to recognize. The expression of people finding something real in a place they had not expected it to exist. Let me tell you about the morning in early September of 2023 when Normand Bélanger turned 74 years old, because what happened that morning tells you more about the previous 22 years than any summary could. Theo came in at 6:30 and found his father already at the Colchester finishing a shaft journal for an order due to ship before noon. Fernand arrived at 7 and started on a set of hydraulic cylinder rods. Carol had the shipping station organized and was pulling orders before 8. Octave arrived at 8:30, put on his apron without ceremony, and went to the cylinder bore. The lathe and the press and the surface grinder were all running by 9. The shop moving with the particular rhythm that comes only from people who have worked together long enough that they don't have to negotiate the floor. Who moves where? Who takes which machine? Who defers when the work requires it? Lisette brought a cake at noon. They ate it at the workbench, parts around them on both sides, the same way she had brought coffee out to the truck in the equipment yard 22 years earlier, when Normand had not yet decided what to do about the letter from Agrippius Laurentides, and she had sat with him while he decided. Normand was not a man who made occasions into more than they were. He ate his cake and looked at the storage shelving along the north wall, not the original shelving from 2001, which had been rebuilt twice, but the current system that Carol had organized and labeled and mapped into the database, where every bin had a number and every number had a record, and every record told you exactly what the part was, what it fit, where the raw material came from, and how it was produced. He said to the room in general that they were in reasonable shape. Theo said that was one way to put it. Let me tell you about what those shelves held, because the inventory describes the shop better than a description of the man ever could. In the Bélanger Mécanique Agricole parts room in September of 2023, there were components for 39 distinct equipment families spanning 5 decades of agricultural and forestry machinery. There were parts for machines whose original manufacturers had been absorbed into larger corporations that no longer acknowledged their existence. There were components machined by Normand's hands and Fernand's hands and Theo's hands, sitting in labeled bins alongside components sourced from the specialty network that Normand had spent 2 years building in 2002 and 2003. And alongside the last of the original Agri PS inventory, which Normand had rationed so carefully over 22 years that a small quantity of certain items, specific seal kits, a set of planetary gear carriers for a Massey combine drive, a dozen kingpin assemblies, remained on the shelf, used only when there was no manufactured alternative. Every bin had a label. Every label corresponded to a database record. Every record had been entered or verified by Lisette. The shops and cooperatives and municipal maintenance departments that called Bélanger Mécanique Agricole in 2023 were not the same ones that had called in 2005. Some of those original shops had closed. Their owners had retired or passed on, and the equipment they had serviced had followed them into history or been sold for scrap. The clients who called now were younger operations, run by people who had come into the trade after the parts supply for older equipment had already dried up, who had never known a time when you could order a hydraulic seal kit for a 1970s timberjack through a regular distributor and expect it to arrive in a week. For them, the shop on Route 169 was not a last resort. It was the first call. It was where you went when the problem was real and the equipment had to work. Let me tell you one final thing, because the story does not end with a birthday cake at a workbench in September of 2023. In the spring of 2024, Theo drove to an equipment auction in Drummondville and came back with a small CNC turning center that had come out of a closing aerospace parts shop. A 2003 Mazik with a worn turret that he rebuilt over 6 weeks using components he sourced from an industrial electronics supplier in Montreal. When it was running, the shop could produce certain complex geometries and fine tolerance components in a fraction of the time the manual machines required. The first production run was a batch of hydraulic valve spools for a client in the Outaways who had been waiting 2 months for a supplier in Ontario that had eventually stopped returning calls. Norman watched Theo set up the first program and run the first part. He watched the inspection. When Theo handed him the finished spool, Norman turned it in his hands, checked the lands with a micrometer, checked the port geometry against the drawing. He set it down on the workbench. He said it was correct. Theo said he knew. The filing cabinet with Norman's equipment manuals is still against the east wall of the shop. He added to it for 46 years, and Theo has been adding to it since, and it holds original manufactural documentation for 52 equipment families in a set of 4-drawer steel cabinets that have been relabeled 3 times. The manuals are not scanned. They are not in any cloud. They are paper in hanging folders organized by manufacturer and then by machine family, and every person in the shop knows how to use them. And the first thing Theo does when an unfamiliar machine comes in is pull the manual and read it from the front, which is what Normand taught him to do, which is what Remy Bélanger taught Normand to do in a barn in St. Prime 50 years ago. The surface grinder Norman rebuilt from rust in Chicoutimi is still on the shop floor. It has had a new spindle, a new magnetic chuck, and a wheel dresser that Theo designed and built in 2019 when the original failed and the replacement was not made anymore. It is not precisely the machine it was when it was new. It is precisely the machine it needs to be, because the people in the shop understood what it was worth and kept it that way. Agri-Pièces Laurentides no longer exists under that name. The Toronto company that bought it was itself acquired in 2009 by a national industrial distribution group. That group was restructured in 2016. The brand was retired in 2018. The parts they stopped carrying in 2001 are not available through any of the successor entities. Their online catalog, if you search it today, returns no results for Timberjack 230 PTO couplings or Massey combined planetary gear carriers, or the hydraulic cylinder seal kits for the forestry equipment that the logging cooperatives of the Mauricie have been running for 30 years. The search works perfectly. The parts are simply not there. They know where to find them, though, the ones who need them badly enough. They end up on Route 169 between Roberval and Saint-Félicien, talking to Theo Bélanger or Lisette Bélanger or Fernand or Octave, and they leave with what they came for. And sometimes they ask how a shop in Lac-Saint-Jean has parts that nobody else in the province carries, and the answer is always the same. A man got a letter in 2001 and drove to Quebec City and bought everything that was left, and then spent the years after that figuring out how to make what he couldn't buy, and he taught everyone around him to do the same. And the shop never stopped running, and the knowledge never left the building. There is a photograph tacked to the wall above the workbench where Normand still sometimes sits in the evening after the others have gone home. It shows Normand and his father, Rémy, standing beside a field cultivator drive assembly that Rémy had repaired in the barn at St. Prime in the summer of 1974. Normand is maybe 16 in the photograph, standing next to his father, with his hands in his pockets, looking at the repaired drive the same way his father is looking at it, which is the way you look at something you understand and respect, and are not finished learning from. The photograph has been on that wall since 1988. The bench beneath it has been replaced. The tools around it have changed. The people working in the building have changed. The way of looking at a machine that the photograph holds has not changed, and it is not an accident that it hasn't. That continuity is the point. It is the whole point. That is what happens when a person decides that knowing how something works is worth more than depending on someone else to supply the part, and builds a shop around that decision, and keeps building and teaches everyone in it to build the same way, and one morning you look up, and the shelves are full, and the machines are running, and the knowledge is still in the building, and the work is still getting done. And that is enough, and it has always been enough.